Good morning, afternoon, or whatever time of day it is. I'm Lauren Harvey, and today we will be discussing renewable energy and with a more specific focus on corn ethanol and its productions and controversies that go around it, the types of vehicles that go around it. And what we'll do initially is we'll take a look at what corn ethanol is directly, which is a biomass. So Webster defines a biomass as plant materials and animal waste used especially for a fuel source. Other scientists will also describe a biomass as normal food crops, crop residue, wood waste, algae, construction debris, and municipal solid waste and food waste, all primarily used as an energy source or a fuel source. Its relevance in the U.S., corn has actually been rising in production since 1987. It's had some dips and whatnot, but we really saw a spike in 2001 with its ethanol production between then and now. A lot of that is attributed to the fact that in around 1999-2000 that we switched from pure gasoline to a 10% ethanol-based gasoline, as well as the fact that corn production was on the rise, with it also declining as a feedstock. So that gave way to using more ethanol, using more corn for ethanol production. Look now at how corn ethanol is actually made. There's two primary ways of making corn ethanol. It's normally through a type of grinding called milling, which is either done by dry milling or wet milling. The industry itself has sided with doing dry milling for a couple different reasons that we'll go over. So it's about 90% of corn ethanol is produced by dry milling. There is also another way called wet milling. A lot of times though, you really only see this in research and things like that. We'll take a look at dry milling first, because dry milling is the majority of how this is all produced. And with dry and wet milling, it's all primarily based on what's done in the early stages. So in dry milling, what they do is it's ground, and after it's been sent through the grinder, it is put into a vat to cook, as they say. So there's just water in there, so it soaks in there and then gets cooked and heated up, and then it is put into tanks to let it liquefy more and then ferment. It's actually very similar to how beer is produced. Fun fact, they actually refer to the slush that it's made with as beer anyway. I don't know if it will taste as good, but probably not. And then after that, it is distilled and then stored as ethanol to be put into vehicles. Fun fact, one main reasons this is done more than wet milling is because it's more cost effective than wet milling, as well as the fact that they have proven that it produces more ethanol than what wet milling does. Now, wet milling, the big difference between what happens in that and in this and in dry milling is that it soaks in the water first, so in the not in water, but in the solution, and they refer to it as steeping before it gets milled. They do this primarily because it will break down the protein matrix of the corn and also increases germ recovery, so it allows them to recover that germ undamaged more likely than if you just send it through the grinder first. From what research I've done, it's mainly done for research purposes nowadays, and that's why it's only about 10% of ethanol production, just because getting all of that solution and whatnot it's a very costly thing to do. and it's also not as efficient at producing ethanol as dry milling is. The types of vehicles that you can actually run with corn ethanol are called flex fuel vehicles. They run off of something called E85. The E85 actually stands just for that it's 85% ethanol instead of our standard 10% ethanol. Interesting enough, the primary countries that use flex fuel vehicles are us in the United States, the European Union, as well as Brazil. In the United States, between 1998 and 2014, as you can see, we've actually sold over 20 million flex fuel vehicles. That does also include like government contracts for government vehicles that run off of flex fuel as well too. Like everything in the scientific process, corn ethanol has definitely had its set of controversies, primarily around just like some different things around it, like the issues that may arise from actually creating it, just the greenhouse gases that would get made from the plants that produce the ethanol, the fertilizers and the pesticides that get utilized on the fields impact, as well as the land usage and water usage, because those large crops do use up a large amount of water and take up a lot of space. Other things that have caused some controversy around it is how corn ethanol works as a flex fuel. So corn ethanol has a higher octane than traditional gasoline, which causes it to be less fuel efficient. So even though it produces about 35% less CO2, it does require, because of the octane output, it does require to get the same amount of gas mileage for about 40% larger gas tank, which almost makes it a wash. So that's why there have been some scientists who have said that it's almost just like switching the problem to something else instead of the problem we have with gasoline. The other positive findings, though, that the Department of Energy and other places like Nebraska have discovered on it is it does produce about 35% less CO2 than traditional gasoline, as well as that there's been a large amount of economic growth produced in states like Nebraska that produce a lot of corn. In fact, they have noticed that around 2010, we're getting towards the higher end of that corn uptick for corn production. They noticed that it went from a $4 billion industry for them to produce ethanol to hovering around a $6 billion to $5 billion, and it stayed pretty steady around there, which makes it very profitable for a state to invest more into that. But that is my speech on corn ethanol. Thank you.